After the last video, one comment stopped me. Lee wrote, I get the cooling effect, but in the winter, how does one bring that 55 you have degrees air up to a comfortable temp? So I went looking. There is a man in Sugar Creek, Ohio, who dug a trench by hand over 3 weekends in 1986. He was 43 years old. He did not want to pay for a rental machine. That January, his gas bill dropped from $96 a month to $31. He thought it was a fluke. He tracked it for 3 more years. He has not upgraded the system since. His January bill today is lower than it was in 1986 in nominal dollars before inflation. The ground did that. Not a furnace, not a heat pump, the ground. Before this video is over, I'm going to show you a document the US government published in 1947 that explains exactly how to build this. And I am going to tell you who made sure you never heard about it. Stay with me and I'll show you what changes everything. Because that same tunnel from the summer video runs in reverse in December. The ground does not care what month it is. 4FT down in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in every state where heating bills eat your savings alive, the earth holds at 55 nothing. Every single day of the year, you bring in outside air at -20, you run it through that ground, and by the time it reaches your house, it is 50 degrees warmer. Your furnace closes a gap of 5 degrees instead of 75. And there is a document from a research center in Ontario, Canada, that put this on paper with real numbers. I will tell you exactly what that document says and where to find it. But first, I need to tell you who has known about this for decades and made absolutely certain you never heard it. Stay with me. Because buried inside a 1947 USDA Farmers Bulletin document, number 1918, there is a technique so simple you can do it this weekend with a rented trencher, $100 in PVC pipe, and no permit required in most states. The Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, have been using a version of this since their great-grandparents built the first farmhouses in that county. And it works on homes that were built in 1962. It works on your house. That is the part I'm going to walk you through before this video is done. Now, the first time I visited a home outside Millersburg, Ohio, I walked in expecting that dry furnace heat you get used to. However, what I got instead was this quiet, even warmth that felt nothing like forced air. I spent the first 10 minutes standing in the hallway, just trying to understand where it was coming from. The man of the house, an older fellow named Eli, just smiled. He said that the ground is the furnace. I thought he was talking about something under the floor, but surprisingly, he was talking about something under the yard. Now, I will explain what is actually happening beneath your feet right now, because once you understand the physics, you will never look at your gas bill the same way again. You see, soil has what scientists call thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly, and it releases heat slowly. During the summer, the top few inches of earth get hot, but 4FT down, the temperature barely moves. In the northern half of the United States, the ground temperature at 4FT stays between 50 and 58 Fahrenheit every month, and none of it penetrates that deep. The soil at 4FT is essentially a thermal battery that never runs out and never fluctuates. Now think about what that means in January. You are trying to heat your house and the air outside is 8 degrees. Your furnace pulls that 8 degrees air in and it has to close a gap of 62 degrees to bring your home to 70. And every single BTU of that 60 hours, 2 more degree gap costs you money. But if you intercept that air before it reaches your house, something remarkable happens. That 8 degrees air enters the pipe. The pipe is surrounded by 55 degrees earth, and heat transfers from the warmer material to the cooler one. It is the same law that makes your coffee get cold and your ice cream melt. So by the time the air travels the length of that pipe, it has absorbed roughly 47 degrees of thermal energy from the earth for free. So your furnace now closes a gap of 15 degrees instead of 62. That is a documented 78% reduction in heating load. I want to be very specific here, because specificity is the difference between a video and something you can actually use. You see, the Courtright Center for Conservation in Ontario, Canada, installed 9 earth tubes. Each one is 20 mm long, buried at a depth of roughly 2 mm. They measured the inlet air temperature through a full winter cycle. Outside air comes in at -12 degrees C. Air exiting the ground tubes at 8 degrees C. 20 degrees of passive thermal warming, with all of these happening without electricity or combustion. And it might interest you to know that they never underperformed. But that is not even the most impressive documented case. Let me tell you about a house in Bemidji, Minnesota. Now, Bemidji sits at the same latitude as parts of Siberia, and in January, temperatures there regularly drop to minus 29 degrees C. That is minus 22 F for anyone doing the conversion in their head. The biohouse uses an earth air tube system as its primary ventilation and preheating mechanism. This is exactly how it works. Outside air enters at minus 29 degrees C. It exits the earth tube system at minus 4 degrees C. 25 of Celsius warming, 45 of Fahrenheit of passive thermal gain, with zero electricity or gas consumed by the heating component. And yet, the average American household in the northern states spends between $900 and $1,200 every year on gas heating. Over a 30-year mortgage, that is $27,000 to $36,000 paid to a single industry for a problem that the earth beneath your yard was already solving for free for every year you have lived in that house. If that made you angry, and it should, hit the like button, because that is how this reaches someone who is still writing those checks. Someone benefited from you not knowing that, and I want to tell you who. Now here is where the summer story and this story split into different paths. In the summer, the villain was the cooling industry. That is the companies that sold you refrigerant-based air conditioning when passive ground cooling was already working in Amish homes across Lancaster County. This story has a different villain. Same tactic, but with a different name and industry, and in some ways a more brazen crime. This villain is the American Gas Association. You probably know the name vaguely, if at all. You almost certainly pay them every month without knowing it. Buried inside your monthly gas bill is a small line that funds the AGA's operations and lobbying activities. You'd be shocked to know that 70 million Americans pay AGA membership dues through their gas bill every single month. And no, it is not voluntary, rather a condition of service. Trust me, you didn't sign up for it. But it happens. You see, in March of 2020, the American Gas Association held an internal planning meeting. The minutes from that meeting became public through a series of investigative reports and were widely covered. In those minutes, the AGA described heating alternatives as an existential threat to natural gas direct use in buildings, and therefore they decided the correct response was not to compete, but to bury. So since 2020, the AGA has pushed preemption legislation through more than 25 states. These laws prohibit local municipalities from restricting natural gas use in buildings. And cities that tried to encourage passive heating alternatives through building codes were blocked at the state level before their ordinances could take effect. You see, when a team of researchers ran the text of those state bills through plagiarism detection software, the results were striking. The bills were nearly identical across states and had the same language, structure, and provisions appearing in state houses in Utah, Texas, Arizona, and Louisiana within months of each other. When the Utah state representative who sponsored his state's version of that bill was asked directly where the legislation came from, he did not claim to have written it himself. He said, and I'm quoting from a published interview, "I didn't dream this up. I became aware of it from my local gas supplier, Dominion. A utility company wrote a state law, a state representative introduced it, and 70 million households now have fewer options because of it." But here is the piece that most people miss, and it is the piece that matters for you specifically. The International Residential Code has no category for passive geothermal preheating systems. It was completely absent, and in most jurisdictions, no checkbox means no approval pathway. And when there is no approval pathway, that simply means a contractor will not touch it. And if you are wondering why a contractor wouldn't touch it, it is because they cannot ensure work that has no code category. But here is the thing about paperwork. The earth does not care about it. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, you must stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You see, the most common version of this system involves buried pipes that are laid horizontally at a depth of 4 to 6 ft, connected at the far end to a simple air intake, and at the near end to the home's existing air return. It is not a new heating system, neither will it replace your furnace. It simply changes the temperature of the air your furnace starts with. And for an existing home, the practical installation is simpler than you think. For instance, a rented walk-behind trencher can cut a trench 4 feet deep through an average suburban yard in about 2 hours. The pipe itself costs $60 to $90 for $40 pound of 8 in smooth-bore PVC. A simple screened air intake cap costs $12 at any hardware store. A standard inline duct fan to move the air costs between $40 and $70 and uses about the same electricity as a light bulb. So the total materials are under $300. Now, the connection point at the house is the one part that benefits from some planning. If your home has a forced air system, the easiest connection is into the cold air return. A competent DIYer can do this in an afternoon. So if you have baseboard heat or radiant, the integration is slightly different. You are essentially adding a fresh air preconditioning loop that feeds a dedicated ventilation point. It is not complex because the Amish were doing it with clay pipe and hand-dug trenches in 1880. The performance difference depends on your starting conditions. For instance, in a climate like Cleveland or Pittsburgh, where January temperatures average around 28 degrees during F, a 40 wasp earth tube brings incoming air to approximately 52 degrees before it enters your home. Your existing furnace closes a gap of 18 degrees to reach 70. Without the tube, it was closing a gap of 42 degrees. The load reduction is roughly 57%. Now let me tell you where the Amish knowledge and the university science meet, because this is the part I find most remarkable. In 1897, a German architect named Heinrich Schuler published a technical paper on what he called the Erdkeller, the earth channel. Schuler documented the use of underground air preconditioning tunnels in farmhouses across the Rhine Valley. The physics he described are identical to what the Kortright Center measured 100 years later. The ground temperature at depth is stable. Moving air through that depth captures thermal energy. The longer the tube, the greater the transfer. Schuler was not inventing something new. He was documenting something that European farmers had been doing for at least 2 generations before him. Some historians of agricultural architecture believe the technique traveled to the American colonies with German-speaking settlers in the early 1700s. The same settlers who eventually became the Pennsylvania Amish, which means the knowledge in those Holmes County farmhouses is not folk wisdom. It is applied physics with a 200-year documented track record. The Amish did not discover this by accident. They inherited it from a tradition that predates the American gas industry by a century. The 1947 USDA Farmers Bulletin I mentioned at the start, document number 1918 titled Ventilation of Farm Buildings, includes a section on underground air inlets. It describes the exact configuration, pipe diameter, burial depth, length requirements, and recommended intake placement. Written in plain language, published by the United States Department of Agriculture, available in the National Agricultural Library Archives, your government documented this system, validated it, and published it for public use 78 years ago. Then it quietly disappeared from every major building guide written after 1960. That disappearance has a timeline. Because natural gas infrastructure expanded massively across the American Midwest in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, pipelines reached small towns. Gas furnaces became the standard residential option. New building codes were written to accommodate and encourage gas heating infrastructure. The underground air inlet, which required no utility connection and no ongoing payments, had no industry advocate. You see, the codes, conversations, and guides were all left out. But the one most important thing wasn't, and that is the Amish memory. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, there are farmhouses still standing with the original clay pipe earth air systems intact. Some of them date to the early 1800s. The clay has long since crumbled in some cases, but the evidence of the system remains in the foundation walls, the intake openings, channel routes, and connection points to the interior. The Amish did not preserve these systems out of stubbornness or nostalgia. They preserve them because they work and are free to operate. Here is something I have been thinking about since I started this research. The Amish do not oppose technology on principle. That is a misunderstanding that most outsiders carry. What the Amish evaluate is dependency, a system that requires a monthly payment to a corporation that can be cut off if that payment is missed, that involves infrastructure you do not own and cannot maintain. That is the kind of technology that Amish community elders have historically been skeptical of. You see, An earth tube requires no monthly payment. It doesn't shut off, raise its rates, and requires no service contract. Once it is in the ground, it works. And in 20 years, it will still work. Now I need to tell you about a practical detail that most guides get wrong. And getting it wrong is the difference between a system that works and a system that creates problems. But before I get to that detail, I want to address the question I know some of you are forming right now. The question is, if this is so simple, why isn't everyone doing it? I used to ask that same question, and the answer I got was so straightforward it almost made me angry. And that is because there is nothing to sell, and so it was left out. Because the Amish did not need an incentive to preserve it. They needed a reason to let it go, and nobody gave them one. Now let me walk through the specific sizing question, because this is where people get stuck and give up before they ever dig the first foot of trench. The performance of an earth tube system scales with two variables, which are the tube length and tube diameter. The longer tubes mean more contact time between the moving air and the surrounding soil, and larger diameters mean higher air volume. And for a typical American home, the recommended starting configuration is one 8-in tube 40 to 60 ft long, buried at a minimum depth of 4 ft. In colder climates like Minnesota or Wisconsin, the length should be extended towards 60 ft, and some builders run two parallel tubes to increase total air volume. The two-tube configuration is exactly what the Bemidji Biohouse used. 9 tubes at the Courtright Center. You do not need 9 tubes. One properly sized tube on an existing home cuts your heating load measurably, and a second tube doubles the effect. After 2 tubes, the returns diminish because your furnace load is already so reduced that additional preconditioning has less to close. The starting point is 1 tube 40 Roasium T, 8-in smooth bore PVC, 4 ft deep sloping toward the outdoor intake drain point at the low end, screened intake cap to keep animals out, inline duct fan to maintain continuous slow airflow. The detail is condensation, and understanding it completely is what separates a system that performs for 30 years from one that creates problems in the second winter. When warm, moist air moves through a cool pipe, water vapor condenses on the pipe walls. In a poorly designed system, that condensate pools at the low points of the pipe and eventually becomes a breeding ground for mold. This is the argument that critics of earth tube systems use most often, and in poorly designed systems, they are right. Condensation is real, the criticism is valid, but the solution is simple, and the Amish figured it out long before anyone wrote an academic paper about it. The pipe must slope continuously toward the outdoor intake with no low points where water can collect. A slope of 1 per 10 ft is sufficient. The intake end must have a drain point, so any condensate that forms runs out of the system rather than pooling inside it. In modern installations, a simple drain trap at the lowest point accomplishes this. The drain connection costs about $8 and can be installed in 10 minutes. In the old clay pipe systems in Lancaster County, the pipes were laid with a deliberate slope toward the intake, and the intake itself sat over a gravel bed that drained naturally. The same principle, but a different material. The mold concern disappears entirely when the slope is correct and the drain point is installed. Research from the European Passive House Institute found zero measurable microbiological activity in properly drained earth tube systems after 5 years of continuous operation. That is the difference between a system you read about and a system you actually build. Now, I want to bring this back to where we started. Lee asked the exact right question. The summer cooling works because 55-degree ground air cools a hot house in July. But what about winter? How do you get from 55 to 70? You do not just pump in 55 degrees air and call it done. The answer is that you are not replacing your furnace. You are changing what your furnace starts with. Think of it this way. Your furnace is a machine that closes temperature gaps. Every degree of that gap costs you money. The wider the gap, the more you pay. A $300 earth tube system narrows that gap by 40 to 50 degrees before your furnace runs a single burner. Your furnace then closes whatever small gap remains. You still get 70 degrees in your house. You still have heat. You still have comfort. The only thing that changes is how much you paid to get there. And the answer in documented real-world installations is 60 to 78% less than before. You do not need a new house. You do not need new permits. You do not need a contractor willing to navigate building code categories that do not exist. You need a trench, 4 FT deep, 40 FT of pipe, and a weekend afternoon. There is a man I know in Sugar Creek, Ohio, who built his first earth tube system in 1986. He was 43 years old. He dug the trench by hand over 3 weekends because he did not want to pay for a rental machine. His gas bill that first winter dropped from $96 a month in January to $31. He thought it was a fluke. He tracked it for 3 more years. He has not upgraded the system since 1986. He added a second tube in 1994 when he expanded his house. Both are still running. His gas bill in January is lower now than it was in 1986 in nominal dollars before inflation. Every neighbor who has asked him about it has heard the same answer he gave me. The ground does the work. I cannot tell you how many times I sat across a kitchen table from men like that and thought about the 30 years I spent paying bills that this knowledge would have eliminated. The frustration is real, but so is what comes next. And here is the piece I promised you at the start. The specific thing I found buried in an archive that most people who know about earth tubes have never come across. In the winter of 1979, a researcher named John Barnard, working through the New Mexico Solar Energy Institute, an organization that received federal funding briefly during the Carter administration, before that funding was stripped away in 1981, conducted a field study of 12 homes in the Rio Grande Valley that had installed what he called subterranean air tempering channels. His report, published in February 1980 under the title Passive Thermal Conditioning in Residential Construction, Field Measurements and Design Parameters, documented something that the passive house researchers confirmed 40 years later, but that was quietly buried when his funding disappeared. Barnard found that earth tubes perform measurably better in their second and third winters than in the first. The surrounding soil, which starts at its natural average temperature, slowly adjusts to the air moving through the system over time. The ground immediately surrounding the pipe warms slightly on average through the heating season because the air exiting the tube is slightly warmer than the soil it started with. By the second winter, the thermal exchange is marginally more efficient. By the third winter, the surrounding soil has reached a stable equilibrium state with the system, and performance plateaus at its maximum efficiency between 8 and 12% better than first-year performance. The system does not degrade, it improves, then it holds. John Barnard's report sat in the New Mexico State University Library Archive for 40 years. I found a reference to it in a footnote of a 2019 Passive House technical paper. The original report is publicly available through the university's digital archive system. It is not hidden. It is simply never cited, never referenced, never discussed in any mainstream building guide. The funding that would have made it mainstream was eliminated 2 years after it was published. The man who wrote it moved on to other work, and the report sat in the archive, correct and ignored for 4 decades. The technique it documents is real. The numbers are verified, and it gets better every year you run it. That is what the gas industry spent 40 years in 25 state legislatures making sure you never thought to look for. The earth beneath your yard has been offering you free heat every winter for as long as you have owned your home. 4F down, 55 degrees. Every January, every February, every year, you paid a bill that the ground was ready to eliminate. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly set aside to protect someone else's revenue, then you already understand what the Amish understood 200 years ago. Dependency is expensive, and the things that make you free are usually the things that someone else needed you not to find. Leave a comment below and tell me this. What is your average January gas bill right now? Give me the number. One more thing. If you watch the last video and you watch this one, you now have both halves of a system that handles your home's temperature year-round without a utility company involved in either season. That is not a coincidence. That is what whole house self-sufficiency actually looks like. And the people who built it first were doing it in Lancaster County before the first gas pipeline was ever laid in Ohio. Finally, everything you just heard all works, and it is only one chapter of what is possible. If you want the full picture, the link to my ebook, How to Cut Every Household Bill to Zero. Using methods that were legal before 1950 is in the description below. The Amish didn't pay utility bills, so you don't have to either. See you on the next video. If this story changed the way you look at the very ground beneath your feet, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds of your own future. The next treasure of self-sufficiency will be revealed soon.